Hello, I'm Terry Loman. I'm the lead organizer for Iowan. I prefer to call it Iowan because it really gets a mouthful of marbles if you try to say Iowa. UU Witness Advocacy Network. I'd like to invite the panelists for the first group to come up. That would be Connie Ryan Terrell and Adam Mason and Erica Johnson. It's really good to see everybody here. We have people from Spirit Lake and we have people from the Quad Cities, so some people really went way out of their way to join us today. I'm really grateful for that. We're going to have just a few minutes of each person talking, and if you have questions, we will pass out cards. If you raise your hand, we'll give you a card. We'd like to do it that way because we need to have a really snappy schedule or we'll get behind.
My name is Erica Johnson, like he said, and I do advocacy for the ACLU of Iowa, specifically working on immigrant rights and racial justice issues. The ACLU nationally is an organization that's been around for about 100 years, quite a while. In Iowa, 75, still quite a while. One of the first state chapters that was formed for the ACLU, which is a thing I learned recently, which is kind of cool. But I've been with the ACLU for about a year now, working on organizing, doing advocacy for local, state, and federal issues, as well as statewide coalition building on those issues. And then ACLU sort of generally, we work on a plethora of different things, but including racial profiling, gender equality, immigrant rights issues. Folks who are from Iowa probably know our voter suppression lawsuit, among other things. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about today specifically, sort of in line with connecting folks with ways to take action on a specific issue here in Iowa, that is a real thing that we're working on. I wanted to talk to you about the Temporary Visitors Driver's License Program. Do folks know what that is? Yep. Nodding heads, very good. So a little bit of background, and I brought all kinds of information for you. It's out on the table by the registration table when we, outside the door here. So just a little bit of background. Right now there's 13 jurisdictions that have, that offer driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants. So that's 11 states. There's a map out there. I can't name them all from memory at this point, but so 11 states, also the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico offer driver's licenses. And Iowa is considering this. So I give a little bit of background if that's helpful as to kind of what brought us here. But generally in 2012, sort of backing up federally, President Obama offered deferred action for childhood arrivals for young immigrants. And this is sort of a way of allowing them to avoid deportation while also getting documentation to allow them to work. So this was granted, like I said, in 2012. Folks applied for it, and then in Iowa, in 2013, they went to apply for licenses, and the Department of Transportation said, no, we don't think that you are you qualify under the Iowa code to get driver's licenses in the state of Iowa, which folks thought was completely wrong, and they wanted to tackle. And so a lot of great local organizing went on early 2013, including folks from Interfaith Alliance, CCI, and a lot of other groups across the state. You guys too, I think, were there, although I wasn't working on the issue at the time. So what happened was, because of that great organizing and because of some direction from the federal government, the Department of Transportation said, okay, fine, we agree, we're going to allow you to get driver's licenses. And so what happened, because of that good organizing, there was some energy and momentum that was created around the idea of providing driver's licenses for a broader group of immigrants in Iowa. So not just young folks, but all undocumented immigrants in Iowa. And so there was a bill that was presented by Senator McCoy in 2013, and then another one that was presented in this last legislative session, 2014. And the work that we've been doing specifically on this campaign and the support that has been built has been driven primarily from immigrant rights groups, of course, for obvious reasons, but also by the law enforcement community. And what we've heard in other states who have passed this legislation is that it's really a matter of public safety, a common sense public safety issue. So in Iowa, we've got 10 law enforcement officials, chiefs of police, public safety officers, and sheriffs who support this because they really see the fundamental need to have drivers on our roadways that are licensed, tested, and insured. Plus, they understand that having an identification card really helps them identify who individuals are in the communities, and if they are criminals, correctly being able to identify them is important for a lot of reasons. And also working with victims within communities, especially vulnerable communities, victims of domestic violence and others. Having that identification is really an important tie-in that helps build a relationship between law enforcement and vulnerable communities. Another big component of support, or the background for this driver's license issue, is the economic angle. There's a professor at Drake who's written a paper called it's called Living in a Car Culture Without a License. And she really looks at what it's like to live, especially in rural communities, without a license. So in Iowa, we know that this is being able to drive, to take your kids to school, to take your kids to the doctor, to go to school, to go to church, to go to the grocery store, to go to work. All of these things you kind of need a car for in Iowa, unless you live in a place that has great public transportation. Are there any? So in Iowa, this is a really important thing for the economy. And so there's also several business leaders around the state who have indicated their support for this type of legislation. Also because, especially if you have a fleet of vehicles, we see this, the business complex over here, a lot of them are driving trucks on the road, and if you've got a fleet of vehicles, if you're driving trucks, you want to make sure the other drivers on the road are also insured. And then, like I said, also big support from immigrant rights communities. So what we're doing, like I said, is working up towards the next legislative session so that we can present a bill. And what we're asking folks to do between now and then, I've got some cards that I'll pass out real quick here, is to take action. So there's a website that has been put together for a broad coalition of supportive groups. You guys are already signed on, right, Terry? I think so. I remember putting your name on. You're signed on. So what we're asking folks to do is educate yourself about the issue. Like I said, there's lots of great information out on the table. There's also some on the website, which is iowasaferoads.com. Pretty simple, www.iowasaferoads.com. List yourself as a supporter, your organization, your business, those kind of things. List yourself as a supporter on that website. Also meet with your local law enforcement and talk to them about the idea, take their temperature, ask them to be a supporter. Third, meet with your elected official, talk to them about the idea. We're going to need a couple of sponsors this legislative session. In order to move forward, we'll need broad bipartisan support, so we need Republicans and Democrats. And then lastly, asking folks to write a letter to the editor for local papers, guest columns, those kind of things, so we can continue the public education. So I'll pass these around, and then we can ask questions later.
Good afternoon. I'm Connie Ryan Terrell, and I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and I'm very grateful to Terry for inviting me and each of us to speak with you, and what a great occasion and great group of people. And I'm mostly excited just to connect with other people of faith from across the state. Interfaith Alliance of Iowa is 18 years old. And we were started here in Des Moines after a school board election in Des Moines. We were started because there was a school board member who had been on the board for 12 years, and he was attacked from a religious right organization when he was up for re-election. And that was Jonathan Wilson, if you know his name, a very well-respected lawyer here in Des Moines. And as I said, he had been on the school board for 12 years. To his friends and family, they knew that he is a gay man, and it was not necessarily generally known in the public of his sexual orientation, but that shouldn't have been an issue. But the religious right came into our community and made that the issue of the election. And our school board elections are very short, 6 weeks is the time frame essentially in Iowa. So there was not the ability to rally a campaign to defend him and to put accurate information out there at that time. That was in 1995. So the religious right won, and he was ousted from his seat solely on the basis of his sexual orientation. After that election, a number of people got together and said there needs to be a progressive voice that can work on these issues and can balance what is being said, particularly from the religious right, but in other instances where there is extremism as well. So Interfaith Alliance of Iowa was born out of that, and we have been doing that work ever since. Kind of the tagline that I usually use for the work that we do is promoting religious freedom, so that really is the core of the work that we do, ensuring equality, challenging extremism, and promoting civility, because if we can't have these conversations in a civil manner, then we're not going to get very far, so that's important to us. We do education work on a variety of issues that are related to each of those core areas. So anything from immigration reform and most recently working on the migrant children issue along with Erica and a number of different other organizations. And really that has heightened this summer, as you know, because of the number of children fleeing Central American countries, coming to the United States, and of course our governor making statements that Iowa is not going to welcome those children. So a number of organizations have stepped up and have been doing work to figure out how we can be welcoming. So we do those immigration issues. We do a lot of issues around LGBT rights. We have just started to get into work around the new Jim Crow and issues around our prisons and judicial systems. Public education is a huge part of our work, and making sure that we have well-funded public education systems, and particularly we work on the issue of bullying and stopping bullying. We have long been part of that conversation in the public square in Iowa, and a number of other issues as well. We do our work through education, as I said, advocacy, and coalition building. I can't really name an issue that we do that we don't work in coalition with other organizations who come to the table to solve and work on issues of social justice. And all of those issues that I named, we work in coalition with a broad spectrum of folks. So that might be civil rights groups, it might be business groups, it might be other faith groups, just a variety of different partners. The most fun part of my job is to actually lobby. And I know that sounds very strange because lobbyists don't really have a good reputation, right, Adam? Right. Yeah. But it really is, in Iowa, a good process. And we can get frustrated over it, but at the end of the day, Iowa has a very open legislative process. And so during the legislative session, I am up at the Capitol each and every day that the legislature is there. And I hang out and I talk with legislators and I talk with my colleagues from other organizations. We do a lot of good work. A lot of the work that Interfaith Alliance of Iowa does really is to stop legislation that is going to take people's rights away. What I've learned over the years is most lobbyists have to do a lot of work to try and stop legislation that is against the interest of their organizations. I always thought that I was kind of in the minority of having to do that, but I've learned that that's an important role for lobbyists. And so we do a lot of work in that area. An example of that, it was in 2011. There was a bill that is similar to the bill that we see happening around the country, and Iowa was really one of the first that had the bill that would have allowed people to discriminate if they were running a business of a public accommodation, the bill would have allowed them to decide who they could serve and who they could not serve. We called it the Little Old Lady Baker bill. So the example was that if a little old lady was running a bakery business out, cake baking business, wedding cake business out of her house, that she ought to have the right to decide who she's going to make a cake for and who she's not going to make a cake for. And our point was that if you put your shingle up and you're a business in Iowa, then you cannot discriminate. And we have very strong civil rights laws in Iowa. And so we were able, as an organization and working in coalition with a number of different organizations, to stop that bill. And that was important work, and we were successful in that in 2011. The coming session, one of the biggest things that we'll be working on is the anti-bullying bill. And I want to be clear that it will not be the governor's bill that we're working on. We will be working on another bill that we helped to devise ourselves and based in best practices. So if you're interested in the work that Interfaith Alliance of Iowa does and our Action Fund as well, there is information also out at the table on our work, and I would ask you to consider being part of our work and part of our organization. You can join with that, and most of our communication is by email, and so we would love to have you be part of that as well. Thank you.
Again, yeah, thank you to all of you for having me here, Terry, for inviting us. It's truly an honor to be here with you today and to be on such a great panel with Erica and Connie. At Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, Iowa CCI, we follow their lead on the issues that you've heard about today. Very important issues. Connie didn't mention protecting the right to vote. The attacks on voting rights that we've seen over the couple of years, and definitely follow their lead on that. And of course, our work with immigrants at CCI, definitely we follow the work of the ACLU on trying to win driver's licenses for all. So very important work. Iowa CCI, for those of you who don't know, and I see some familiar faces, so that's good, but I see a lot of new faces, which is even better. Iowa CCI is a grassroots community organization. We've got about 3,200 members across the state. Right now in 98 of Iowa's 99 counties. I think there's one person who didn't renew this year down in Fremont in the far southwest corner, so I need to get down there. But we've been around for 40 years, founded in 1975 by 4 Catholic priests who saw a need at that time in the Waterloo community that wasn't being met by the Catholic Church. And so a priest kind of left the priesthood and founded this organization to work at that time with low-income folks in the community to identify things that they felt needed to be addressed. Kind of with the guiding principle that everyday people, when given an opportunity, can be a powerful force for justice and for change. And that guiding mission is still what kind of fuels us today. We work on a number of different issues, and excuse me, facts and getting our facts right is extremely important. At CCI, we try and cover our bases when it comes to getting the facts right. That's hugely important. But when it comes to winning hearts and minds, we feel that people's personal stories can go a long way in truly swaying the hearts of those and helping us connect, feel empathy with others in our communities. So to tell you about some of the issues that we work on, we work on farming and environmental issues, water quality, family farming issues. What that means, though, out in rural Iowa is that somebody like Lori Nelson, who lives in Bayard, up in Guthrie County, she's surrounded by 15,000 corporate hogs who spread liquid manure up to her backyard. If she wants to have a picnic on a fall day like today, she might have to deal with the fact that manure spreaders are going to be out there from a corporate factory farm less than a quarter of a mile from her house. It means that when we talk about financial security, somebody like Farrell Wagner, who spent the better part of her life raising 3 disabled sons, lost what retirement she had saved in 2008 when the banks crashed our economy. She's angry, but at the same time, she wants to see the promise of Social Security expanded and extended to future generations. So she stays involved. When it comes to issues like worker justice, Natalie Espinosa, a naturalized citizen who lives here in Des Moines, was hired through a temp agency and placed in a warehouse packing stuff for some supply chain, never knowing exactly who her true employer was, so that when she stopped getting paid, even though she kept on showing up to work, who could she go to demand her rightful paycheck? Those are the kinds of issues that we take on at Iowa CCI. The last one, is trying to get big money out of politics. I'm sure at this point in an election year, we're all sick and tired of the ads. And like Connie said, yeah, there's lots of lobbyists up at the Capitol. Fortunately, there's some good ones too, so it's always great to see a smiling face or to have a colleague there, an ally that you can sit down and talk to and strategize with. But the last thing we really try and do is to get big money out of politics, to take on the corporate control of our elections, because ultimately what we want to do is put people back in the decision-making process. People need to be in control of our democracy. People need to be in control of our economy, and we see that slipping away. So that's kind of what we do. Farming and environmental issues, clean water, very important. Protecting our paychecks, raising the minimum wage, making sure that workers get paid a fair wage and maintain dignity in their work is vital work that we take on. I'll get some information out on the tables too, and look forward to any questions you have. Just want to say that our philosophy of organizing, we focus on using our issues to set up the elections so that when folks vote, they're considering not just the personality or the character of candidates, but actually where they stand on issues. And then hopefully we're using those elections to advance our issue work as well. We do this through base building, one-on-one contact with more folks, meetings like this, meetings out in communities across the state, using local campaigns. For instance, if there is a factory farm that's polluting, we want to go out and try and fix that. In a position where somebody's not getting paid, we want to meet with that employer and ask them to pay their workers. So those kinds of local campaigns, but also working within government agencies to make sure that laws that are on the books are enforced, and then of course advocating for better laws, making sure that through the lawmaking process, the voices of everyday folks are heard. So thank you for your time. Look forward to your questions.
The question is why we're not supporting the governor's anti-bullying bill. I shouldn't say that we're not supporting the bill coming this year because we don't know what it'll be, but I know based on the last 2 years what it was, and I can't imagine that it's going to be a whole lot different. The bill that the governor put forth the last couple of years, and actually there were some legislative bills as well, were not based in best practices. They were not based in research of where the gaps are in our current law. Our current law was passed in 2007 with the help of a whole coalition of organizations that are either civil rights organizations, organizations like Interfaith Alliance, and education organizations who have the expertise in education. So that bill, that law was put into place in 2007. It was one of the best in the nations at the time. And believe it or not, in 7 years' time, we have learned a whole lot since then on anti-bullying practices, best practices. And so the bill that the governor put forth the last 2 years was really more of a bill, in my opinion, that was a political bill. It was putting your finger up in the wind and figuring out what the public thought we should do with anti-bullying efforts. And not that we shouldn't engage the public in the conversation, we absolutely should. But just because something becomes the mantra of what's happening doesn't mean it's best practices. So for example, one of the pieces of the governor's bill, and actually a legislative bill as well, was parental notification. On the surface, parental notification sounds wonderful, that administrators should have to tell parents that their child is being bullied. The problem is that we have kids who live in homes that are not safe. And so if you compel an administrator to tell the parent that their child is being bullied, what's the next question going to be? Why is my child being bullied? And if you disclose to that parent, directly or indirectly, that the child is gay or lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and that parent doesn't know it, and it's a very conservative household, that child can then come home and either be abused and or kicked out of the home. Those are very real statistics. 40% of children who are homeless are LGBT and have been kicked out of the house because of their sexual orientation. That's real. And so trying to get the legislators and the governor to understand that mandating parental notification is not best practices was a very difficult process last year. And finally, because of leadership in the Senate, we were able to stop the governor's bill in the spring because we could not get them to take it out. We wanted to make the bill better. We wanted to take that piece out and a couple of other pieces and put some good practices in, but that wasn't happening, and so we became the only voice up there to stop that bill. So we are going to do it better and smarter this time and build a coalition of education associations to put forth a bill that is based in best practices to fill in those gaps of what is not currently in law.
Are there more questions people want to keep pushing up? We've got another one here about the new Jim Crow. It sounds like this is a book that folks are familiar with. Michelle Alexander's book says she clearly defines the war on drugs as the largest systemic tool for racial oppression. In the U.S., Iowa has the highest ratio of disproportionate minority contact by law enforcement, leading to the decimation of African American and Latino communities. What role can or should Iowan, is that how we're saying it? Iowan play in dismantling the drug war here in Iowa? Good question. I think there's a couple of things, sort of a process in my head, but one of the things that I think that we can all start by doing is educating all of our communities, be that Black, white, brown, Latino, Hispanic, African American, etc. Being aware of our rights and knowing how interplay with law enforcement should go. It can be a really scary experience for anyone. I know it is for me when I get pulled over speeding. But I think that that's a really good place to start is working to educate our communities, especially the most vulnerable communities, on what exactly their rights are so that they can identify abuse when it happens and know how to report that. I think that part and parcel within that whole process is allowing people and empowering them to tell their stories about abuse that is happening so we can help identify specific issues and take those to the appropriate decision makers. One thing policy-wise, though, as far as like a specific thing that you folks could be involved in, is we're working on building a coalition to support the idea of passing a policy in Iowa that would decriminalize marijuana. So this is somewhere between what we have now, the legalization of how do you pronounce it? The cannabinoid oil, is that right? And full legalization. And so it's somewhere between there. And what it would do is decriminalize or make it a civil penalty to have an ounce or less of marijuana. We know that studies have shown, including one that the ACLU released last year nationally, that even though usage rates, especially for marijuana, are basically the same across races, genders, ethnicities, if in Iowa, well, in everywhere across the country, if you're African American, you're way more likely to get arrested for possessing marijuana. In Iowa, we're worst in the nation. If you're African American in Iowa, you're 8 times more likely to get arrested for having weed than a white person. And so one specific way that we could address that disparity is by passing this decriminalization bill that would really have a long-lasting impact on someone's life. If they do get caught for having, like I said, an ounce or less of marijuana, they would get a civil penalty similar to a speeding ticket and a $100 fine. This is what we're proposing, a $100 fine, instead of getting some serious charges that will stay on their record for a long time, impact their life in any number of ways, including not being able to access loans for education, not being able to access loans for housing, not being able to get a job, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one specific thing. Talk to me if you want to find out more about specifically what to do. Like I said, we're working on building a coalition, and that starts with public education, presenting at groups like this, having conversations, and building from there.
So there's 2 more questions they have. I'm going to take one, and then I'm going to ask Connie to kind of tag team the next one with me. So the first question that I got here is, for Iowa CCI, do you plan to fight the oil pipeline? I'm guessing we're talking about the Bakken oil pipeline that's been proposed by Energy Transfer Partners out of Dallas, Texas. For those who aren't familiar, they are fracking oil fields up in North Dakota, and they want to transport that crude across the state through, I believe it's like a 32-inch pipeline that they would bury 4 to 5 feet underground, and it would go from the far northwest corner of Iowa diagonally across the entire state, exit the state down in Lee County in southeast Iowa, go about 150 miles into Illinois, where they would put it on trains, ship it down to a refinery in Texas, and from there export it across the globe. So the short answer is yes, we plan on fighting this pipeline. Just pipelines in general, it's not a question of when will they spill, or it's not a question of if they will spill, but when will they spill. And considering the water pollution crisis that we already have in Iowa, burying these pipelines where you can't tell if they're leaking, can't tell if they're going to break, exposing that to potential groundwater sources. At some point, it's going to have to cross the Des Moines River here in Iowa, and that leads to drinking water for 500,000 people here in central Iowa. On top of that, and the man right there, Irv Kloss, can tell you about our statewide drainage districts. There's no comprehensive map of all of the farm fields across Iowa that have been tiled. No comprehensive map that lays out where these tiles are. And so field by field, they're going to be digging up those tile lines, burying a crude oil pipeline underneath it, and then replacing the tile lines. That's a huge concern. The last concern that we've heard from folks on both sides of the aisle, actually, is just the use of eminent domain to acquire the land to bury the pipeline. Actual land that they'll have to purchase, and then the permanent easement rights that they're demanding to gain access to the land that they've buried the pipeline on. So that's a concern for a lot of farmers in terms of, just are they going to be forced to sell their land? And if so, are they going to have to deal with people coming onto their land basically for the rest of their life? So absolutely, we plan on fighting that. I didn't get into the more progressive debate, which would be if we look at climate change and our country's continued reliance on fossil fuels. I believe that we need to get away from that, and so this seems like just a temporary fix to what some would call an energy crisis. I think we need to be looking at renewable fuels. So a number of angles that we'll be approaching the pipeline from. So this next question, often it feels like the first tactic of some advocacy groups is protesting and arguing. How does your organization engage in constructive conversation with adversaries? So at Iowa CCI, I think we are known for sometimes aggressive tactics. We are an activist organization, very familiar with protests. The one thing I would say, and Connie I think can address civil dialogue, but the one thing there's two things I would say actually. One is that a lot of times the issues that we're working on, I shared some personal stories, there is a lot of anger there. There's a lot of frustration. Can you imagine, you're working for $8 an hour, 40 hours a week, and then you don't get paid. And 2 weeks goes by and you haven't gotten paid, and 3 weeks goes by and you haven't gotten paid, and you've got 3 kids at home, and you're wondering how you're going to feed them and pay your rent and get to work. There's a lot of anger there, okay? People feel anger. And so it's our job as organizers to channel that anger into progressive change. That can be difficult, though, and I think sometimes the companies, the corporations that commit these abuses need to experience some of that anger. They need to hear where people are coming from to truly experience the crisis that they're imposing on people's lives. So, that is a challenge. And the second thing I would say is that a lot of times when you see a protest, that isn't always the first time that the issue's been brought up. At CCI, we always reach out to decision makers for a meeting first. And oftentimes, they're just unwilling to meet. So with that, though, I do want to turn it over to Connie because I think Interfaith does a wonderful job of bringing people to the table.
So we do approach things differently, and different organizations look at issues in different ways, and how we work to create change, systems change, social justice change, all of those different things. We come from a perspective of civil dialogue and public dialogue, and also advocacy with decision makers, as Adam was talking about. So creating conversation around issues. For example, we have Crossroads Luncheon, that's a monthly luncheon here in Des Moines, and an equivalent luncheon in Cedar Rapids called Intersections. And it's really creating conversation on difficult issues at the intersection of religion and politics, which is the crux of what we do. And so we invite an expert person to come and speak, and we have question and answer and dialogue really on whatever the subject is. So getting that education piece out, but also having a better understanding of what can happen and how people can take action. At the legislature, a good part of my work is empowering people to have conversation with their legislators. And that's certainly what I do in my work while I'm up there as well. So it's really about building relationships ahead of time with key decision makers so that I'm not just coming up to a legislator and they have no idea who I am, but I've already built that relationship, and so we can have that difficult conversation on an issue that maybe we're on different sides with. Now, having said that, do I have relationships with all 150 legislators up there? Absolutely not, because there's not enough time in the day, and there also are particular people on that adversary side who I'm not going to make a difference with, and I know that, and so I work on those people who are willing to listen to our viewpoint as well. I think there's a time and a place for different strategies and tactics, but at the end of the day, I think that if you're building relationships and if you're taking advantage of those relationships when there are key issues that are happening. And you as citizens, you're not up there lobbying, but you as citizens should be building those relationships as well with key decision makers in your community, whether that's a legislator or a congressional person or city council or whoever that is, and build those relationships ahead of time so that then when there are issues that you care about and are concerned about, you can go to that person and you've already established that relationship and can have that conversation. I want to talk briefly. I did forget about voting rights when I was talking earlier, and I just want to briefly mention voting rights is such a key issue, and it has been in Iowa, particularly with Secretary of State Matt Schultz, who will no longer be our Secretary of State after the end of the year, but making sure that people have the right to vote and their rights are not taken away from them by virtue of just having to have an ID, and that's been all over the news. It's an important issue, and I hope that you can have a conversation about how you can be involved in that issue. But also when candidates come into your area and you're educating yourself on who you should vote, that's also critically important. And one of the pieces that is out on the table that I left out there is a little pamphlet that is questions that you can ask of any candidate at any level on religious freedom issues. So particularly around separation of church and state, and making sure that candidates are going to respect the Constitution that they swear to uphold. And yes, they can have their religious beliefs, but not inserting their own religion into our public policies. So just would draw your attention to that pamphlet too, and ask you to consider asking those questions of candidates when, whether it's this election cycle or in the future as well.
And there was a follow-up question on the pipeline too, a question asking if pipelines are safer than rail transport when it comes to crude oil. I think we can point to spills, both from rail transport of crude and pipeline spills. I don't have stats or figures in front of me. That's something we probably need to dig up. But I think for me then, that does get back to the bigger question of our future reliance on fossil fuels versus investing now in renewable energies. Here in Iowa, we are the third leading state behind California and I believe Texas in wind power. There's been investment in studies around solar energy here in Iowa. Our governor actually vetoed some state funding for solar research that the Iowa Environmental Council was pushing for. So that's a huge concern. But I think when it comes down to it, looking at that aspect, these are looking at energy for the short term. And if we don't think broader, think bigger in terms of how we're going to power Iowa for the long term, questions about just pipeline transport of crude oil or rail transport are very short-sighted. And so we need to be thinking beyond that, investing in renewable energy sources, building green jobs for the future. I think we've heard Energy Transfer Partners talk about the jobs building the pipeline that would bring to Iowa. And I guess I would just rather see us, if we're going to talk about jobs, let's talk about jobs that will be here and stay here for the long term and at the same time protect our environment.